Hello my YouTube youngsters, and welcome back to the Crime Whisper. I know many of you drift off to sleep with these stories, so before you get too comfy, I'd love for you to leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you're listening from, and of course, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying these cases. Alright, let's settle in, relax, and begin story 1. The case of Crystal McDowell. McDowell's life was marked by hardship from the very beginning. Born to parents who named her after the drug crystal meth, her childhood was anything but stable. By the age of 11, tragedy struck. Both of her parents passed away within just 6 months of each other, each succumbing to complications from AIDS brought on by years of substance abuse. Suddenly, Crystal was left orphaned, forced to face the world on her own. Her teenage years were no kinder. At one point, she was abducted and held captive in a chicken coop, where she endured days of horrific abuse. But Crystal's resilience shone through. She escaped and managed to stay free of her captor. Eventually, she found refuge in Bedtime, Texas, with her aunt and uncle determined not to be defined by her painful past. Crystal worked tirelessly to rebuild her life, and it was in Bedtime where she met Steve McDowell. Seemed like everything she'd ever hoped for. Funny, a lover of video games and fast cars, his sweet demeanor quickly won her over, and Crystal's friends couldn't help but notice the glow of happiness he brought into her life. The two seemed like the perfect couple. Crystal worked as a flight attendant for and with her job came plenty of travel perks. She and Steve would take trips across the US, making memories together. After marrying, they welcomed 2 children, Madden and Maui. Crystal adored them. She was a devoted mother who always put her children's happiness first. From the outside, they looked like a picture-perfect family, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. After 10 years of marriage, Crystal grew increasingly unhappy and finally made the decision to divorce Steve. He, however, was not ready to let go. While Crystal waited for her new home to be finished, she and the children continued living with Steve, making for a tense and complicated arrangement. Still, Crystal was determined to move forward, build a brighter future, and provide stability for her kids. By 2017, Crystal was 37 years old and starting a fresh chapter in her life. She had transitioned into a career in real estate and was looking forward to moving into her new home. On August 25, 2017, she had plans to meet family and friends to watch the much-anticipated Mayweather vs. McGregor fight. Excitement buzzed among those gathered, but Crystal never arrived at first. No one panicked. She was a busy working mom. After all, perhaps she was running late, or caught up with something unexpected. But as hours passed, and Crystal failed to answer texts and calls, worry began to grow. After more than 24 hours of silence, her family made the difficult decision to contact the Chambers County Sheriff's Department. Deputy was dispatched to Crystal's home, where he questioned her ex, Steve. Steve explained that Crystal had recently entered a new relationship and would sometimes spend nights away without telling him, but something in his tone unsettled the deputy. Trusting his instincts, the deputy called for backup soon. A seasoned detective joined him at the scene. During their conversation, the detective noticed a strange detail. Steve was still wearing his wedding band, even though the divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier. Steve was cooperative, but his demeanor felt off. The more investigators observed, the more their suspicions grew. Given the circumstances, the detective contacted the district attorney. After reviewing the reports, the DA immediately suspected foul play. 2 details stood out. Crystal and Steve were divorced, yet still living under the same roof, and Crystal now had a new boyfriend. To the DA, it seemed clear Steve had something to hide, and so what began as a missing person case was about to take a much darker turn. While it was possible that Steve had played a role in Crystal's disappearance, detectives also considered other angles. They believed Crystal's boyfriend might hold important information. The man she had gone out with on the night of August 24, 2017, was Paul Hargrave, a local jeweler whose family store had been a neighborhood fixture for more than 50 years. Paul explained that he and Crystal had spent the evening together, and afterward she returned with him to his home the following morning. While Paul was in the shower, Crystal left his house to back up his account. Paul handed over security camera footage. The video clearly showed Crystal at 7:35 a.m. on August 25th, walking out to her black Mercedes coupe and driving away from his driveway with this. Both Steve McDowell and Paul Hargrave became immediate persons of interest still. Investigators felt there were other leads worth exploring as they dug deeper. Detectives uncovered troubling details about Crystal's marriage. They discovered she had been involved in multiple affairs throughout the relationship, with both male and female flight attendants and pilots. This revelation made them wonder if perhaps a jealous partner or vengeful spouse could have targeted her yet, despite the suspicions. No solid evidence connected these affairs to her disappearance. Then came another blow to the investigation. Just as police were trying to make progress, Hurricane Harvey struck Baytown. The storm unleashed devastation across the county, submerging neighborhoods under floodwaters. Half the county was underwater. Homes and cars were destroyed, and lives were lost. The sheriff's department, overwhelmed by the crisis, had no choice but to divert resources away from Crystal's case. Search and rescue during the hurricane became the priority. For Crystal's loved ones, it was heartbreaking. They now had to take the investigation into their own hands. Her family and friends turned to social media, tirelessly posting about her disappearance on Facebook and Instagram. Desperate for any lead, their efforts soon paid off. One of Crystal's cousins received a message from a friend claiming to have seen her car in a Snapchat post. The vehicle was spotted in the parking lot of a Motel 6 near Interstate 10. When the cousin checked the image, the license plate matched. It was Crystal's Mercedes. The family quickly contacted authorities, but the flooding made it nearly impossible to reach the motel by car. Instead, they resorted to using airboats to navigate through the flooded roads. When they finally arrived at the Motel 6, their worst fears were confirmed. Crystal's black Mercedes sat there, parked haphazardly with the keys still in the ignition. It seemed as though someone had deliberately abandoned the vehicle. Perhaps hoping it would be stolen, the car was towed to a crime lab for processing. But investigators found no evidence that shed light on Crystal's whereabouts. Even Dateline, the popular true crime series, dedicated a segment to her disappearance. But no breakthroughs came. A week after Crystal vanished, the lead detective realized he needed reinforcements. He turned to the Texas Rangers, who quickly joined the case. Their first step was to conduct a formal interview with Steve McDowell. Steve told them he hadn't seen Crystal since she left for her date with Paul on August 24th. From the very beginning, however, his body language unsettled the Ranger. For a man whose ex-wife had vanished without a trace, Steve showed little of the visible worry one might expect. Still, many of Crystal's friends and family defended him. They knew Steve personally and couldn't imagine him hurting her. They pointed to the love he had for his children, Madden and Maui, and believed he would never do anything to harm their mother. But the Ranger wanted certainty. He asked Steve if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test. Steve agreed, seemingly confident in his innocence. The results, however, were shocking. Steve failed miserably, and suddenly, suspicions around him grew even stronger. Just like Steve, Crystal's boyfriend Paul Hargrave also agreed to take a polygraph test. Surprisingly, Paul failed as well. With both men failing, the district attorney began to wonder if there could have been a joint effort to hide the truth about Crystal's disappearance. By now, everyone involved in the case was convinced of one thing: foul play, and most feared the worst, that Crystal was no longer alive. But one critical question remained unanswered: where was her body? If Crystal's remains had been disposed of in one of Baytown's many bayous, there was a very real chance her body had been carried downstream into the Gulf of Mexico, making recovery nearly impossible. An effort to bring answers to Crystal's family. A massive search was organized on September 9th. Nearly 100 people, Texas EquuSearch members and volunteers, joined forces. They divided the wetlands into a grid, carefully combing through the area with ATVs and airboats. Despite the determination and sheer manpower, No trace of Crystal was found still. The Texas Rangers pressed forward. They were determined not only to find her but also to uncover who was responsible. Their investigation turned again toward Crystal's two closest connections, her ex-husband Steve, and her boyfriend Paul. Knowing that surveillance might provide clues, the Rangers canvassed businesses near the Motel 6, where Crystal's car had been discovered. Hours of security footage were reviewed. Finally, a breakthrough. Footage from the morning of August 26th at 6:37 a.m. showed a man parking Crystal's Mercedes in the Motel 6 lot. The video was clear, but the ranger couldn't immediately confirm the man's identity. What caught his attention, though, was what happened next. The individual got out of the car and walked away calmly. Then, hours later, a second video from a nearby gas station revealed something striking: a blue Mustang GTA rare car, and one that matched Steve McDowell's, pulled up to the pump. The driver, resembling Steve, didn't fill his tank. Instead, he walked toward the Motel 6 parking lot, seemingly checking on Crystal's abandoned car. This raised the Rangers' suspicions. Had Steve left the Mercedes there deliberately, hoping someone would steal it, since the keys had been left in the ignition? And if so, how did he get back home afterward? The distance was far too great to walk searching for answers. The ranger reviewed additional footage from surrounding businesses. That's when he spotted something unusual. At 7:05 a.m., about 25 minutes after Crystal's car was abandoned, a man was seen pedaling a bicycle along the Interstate 10 service road. In the pouring rain, the bike had distinctive mag wheels, exactly like one the ranger remembered seeing in the McDowell garage. To the suspicion, Steve had previously told the ranger he'd spent Saturday morning shopping at Walmart. Intrigued, the ranger pulled the store's surveillance footage. What he found was damning. The cameras showed a man who looked exactly like Steve arriving at Walmart wearing a hoodie, just minutes after Crystal's car was left at the Motel 6. He was paying cash for a bicycle with mag wheels. With this evidence in hand, the ranger summoned Steve for a follow-up interview. He laid out every piece of information: the car, the bike, the footage. Yet, Steve continued to deny any involvement in Crystal's disappearance. Despite his denial, the ranger was now certain Paul Hargrave was innocent, and Steve McDowell was solely responsible for Crystal's disappearance. But there was still one major obstacle. They needed Crystal's body without physical remains. Building a watertight murder case would be much harder. Prosecutors would have to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence and convincing a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Without a body is never easy. Finding her remains wasn't just vital for the case, it was vital for Crystal's family. Her loved ones deserved closure and needed to know the truth. What made this even more urgent were troubling comments Steve had made after Crystal filed for divorce. Friends and acquaintances told investigators that Steve had spoken openly about murder and even hinted at taking his own life. This raised deep concerns about the safety of his children, Madden and Maui. Given these threats, the DA decided the children had to be removed from Steve's custody and placed in protective services. The DA then made Steve an offer. If he was willing to lead investigators to Crystal's body, they would reconsider allowing him visitation with his children. But Steve had a counter-proposal. He told them if they allowed him to go home that night, he would return the next morning and tell them everything, finally leading them to Crystal's body. This left the DA with a difficult decision. On one hand, Steve's offer might finally bring the answers everyone desperately needed. On the other, it meant taking a serious risk. Allowing Steve to return home was a gamble. The district attorney knew he could flee, harm himself, or leave Crystal's fate a mystery forever. But the following morning, September 9th, the DA and a Texas Ranger arrived at Steve's home. He opened the door, and during their conversation, he finally began to talk. Steve admitted that he had long known about Crystal's many affairs. When he confronted her, she dismissed his concerns, telling him she sought intimacy elsewhere because he wasn't dominant enough. It was a humiliating blow. The ranger and DA used a sympathetic approach, trying to create a space where Steve felt safe to open up at first. He was guarded, but eventually, Steve confessed. He said that on the day Crystal disappeared, they argued. Crystal told him she no longer loved him, enraged and impulsive. Steve admitted he suffocated her. He insisted it wasn't planned, that he never meant to kill her afterward. He panicked. He wrapped Crystal's body in trash bags, placed her in the trunk of her Mercedes, and drove to a secluded ravine where he disposed of her. Steve offered to lead investigators to her remains, but only on one condition. The death penalty had to be taken off the table reluctantly. The DA agreed, knowing it was the only way to give Crystal's family closures. Family guided them down Needle Point Road, a remote, wooded stretch there. Searchers finally found what was left of Crystal. The condition of her remains was devastating. Was arrested and charged with Crystal's murder. His defense team quickly revealed their strategy. They would argue sudden passion under Texas law. Sudden passion means a person acted in an uncontrollable state of rage, fear, or terror, directly provoked by the victim. If accepted, it could reduce a murder charge to a second-degree felony, punishable by 2 to 20 years in prison. Without it, first-degree murder carried 5 to 99 years. The strategy sparked debate. Critics called it a way of blaming Crystal for her own death. Supporters argued it allowed for context in cases of extreme emotional turmoil, but the DA was firm. This was not sudden passion, it was premeditated murder. And now, it was up to a jury after more than a year of hearings and motions. Steve's trial began in June 2019. The prosecution presented his own confession, the CCTV footage of him abandoning Crystal's car, and the Walmart bike purchase. But the most heartbreaking testimony came from Steve and Crystal's young daughter, Maui, who was just 7 years old. Maui bravely told the court what she remembered that night. Her parents fighting, her father pressing his hands over her mother's nose and mouth, her mother struggling until she stopped moving. She recalled her father telling her to stay in her room and never speak about what she saw. The courtroom was shaken. The defense tried to discredit Maui, claiming she had been influenced by relatives and invented the story. They argued she wasn't a reliable witness. Steve himself then took the stand, against his attorney's advice, with tears streaming down his face. He offered a completely different account than the one he gave investigators. He claimed the fight spiraled out of control, and in frustration, he put Crystal in what he described as a bear hug to calm her down. According to Steve, she suddenly went limp in his arms, and he never intended harm to the DA. This explanation was unbelievable. A man claiming to have hugged his wife to death. The courtroom sat in stunned silence at his testimony. The DA worried about one final possibility, a mistrial. When the jury asked to review Steve's confession video, that concern grew heavier. A mistrial would mean starting from scratch, forcing Crystal's family to relive every painful moment. But just 1 hour later, the jury returned. Their verdict was clear. Steve was found guilty of murder for Crystal's loved ones. It was justice at last, though nothing could erase the grief of her loss during sentencing. Steve's attorneys made a last attempt to lessen the blow. They argued that Crystal's death was the result of sudden passion, hoping to reduce his punishment. The jury rejected the claim instead. They delivered a firm decision. Steve was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Story 2. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, at 9:48 a.m., Houston police received a chilling call. On the other end of the line was a woman named Andrea Yates. She calmly told the operator she was ill and needed an officer at her home. When police arrived, what they found was horrifying. Andrea herself appeared physically fine, but inside her home, her 5 young children lay dead one by one. Andrea had drowned. Then the nation would soon ask the same haunting questions. Why would a mother take the lives of her own children? And what drove her to do it? Andrea Pia Kennedy Yates was born on June 2, 1964, in Houston, Texas, the youngest of 5 children. Andrea grew up in a strict household under her parents, Andrew and Judith. She was bright, disciplined, and ambitious, graduating in 1982 as valedictorian of Milby High School, captain of the swim team, and a member of the National Honor Society after completing nursing school. Andrea worked as a registered nurse at the MD Anderson Cancer Center until 1994, but her life would take a dramatic turn when, in 1989, she met Russell "Rusty" Yates, a NASA engineer that had married in April 1993, and together, they embraced a devout Christian lifestyle following the teachings of preacher Michael Warrenitsky, who claimed women were destined only for motherhood. Andrea and Rusty vowed to have as many children as God would allow by 1994. Their first son, Noah, was born soon. Came John, then Paul, and later Luke. The Yates family moved often, living in Florida briefly, then back to Houston in a cramped motorhome. But behind Andrea's polished exterior, cracks were forming even as a teenager. Andrea had battled depression and bulimia. She sometimes spoke about suicide. Those struggles resurfaced with the pressures of motherhood after the birth of her fourth child. Andrea's mental health began to spire. First major breakdown occurred on June 16, 1999. Rusty found her shaking uncontrollably, chewing her fingers the next day. Andrea attempted suicide by overdosing on pills. Hospitalized, she was placed on antidepressants. But her despair only deepened at one point. She begged Rusty to let her die, even holding a knife to her own neck. Doctors placed her on stronger medications, including Haldol, an antipsychotic. Andrea's condition stabilized, but only temporarily by that summer. She had attempted suicide twice more and was hospitalized again. Doctors diagnosed her with postpartum psychosis, warning Rusty that more children could make her illness far worse. But just weeks after Andrea's release, she became pregnant again. Their fifth child, Mary, was born in March 2000. To protect the baby, Andrea stopped taking her medication for a time. She appeared better, but when her father died in March 2001, Andrea unraveled. She mutilated herself, refused to feed Mary, and had to be hospitalized once again. Doctors stabilized her and discharged her, but her behavior grew more alarming. On May 3, 2001, Andrea filled a bathtub in the middle of the day. When her mother-in-law questioned her, Andrea gave a vague and unsettling reply. "I might need it." The family panicked, suspecting suicide, and arranged another hospitalization within 24 hours, her psychiatrist believed. Andrea had planned to drown herself. She was discharged weeks later, but the danger was far from over. Despite repeated hospitalizations, Andrea's mental health remained fragile. By June 2001, her condition had grown dangerously unstable. Russell, worried but still holding on to faith, often left Andrea alone with the children. Despite doctors' warnings, on the morning of June 20, 2001, Rusty left for work just after 9 a.m. His mother, who often helped Andrea with the kids, had not yet arrived. Within minutes of being alone, Andrea acted on her darkest impulses. She filled the bathtub once again, this time not for herself. One by one, Andrea drowned her children. She began with Paul, age 3, then Luke, just 2 years old. Next was John, age 5. She carried each of their lifeless bodies into the master bedroom and laid them side by side on the bed. Her oldest son, Noah, age 7, quickly realized what was happening when Andrea brought him into the bathroom. He asked, "What's wrong with John?" Moments later, she held him under the water to finally. Andrea turned to her infant daughter, Mary, just 6 months old. She placed the baby in the tub, ending her short life. Andrea left Mary floating in the bathtub while Noah's body was placed beside his brother's. The scene inside the Yates home was one of unimaginable horror. At 9:48 a.m., Andrea picked up the phone and calmly dialed 911. She told the operator she was ill and needed police. Moments later, she called her husband at work, telling him he needed to come home immediately when officers arrived. Andrea appeared eerily composed. She admitted what she had done without hesitation. News of the crime spread quickly, shocking the nation. How could a devoted mother, once described as gentle, and deeply religious, take the lives of her own 5 children? Investigators soon discovered the answer lay in Andrea's long battle with postpartum depression and psychosis. Her illness had gone untreated for too long, worsened by the pressures of raising 5 children in isolation. In her first statements to police, Andrea explained that she believed her children were doomed to eternal damnation in her delusional state. She thought killing them would save their souls. The case of Andrea Yates ignited an intense debate in America. Was she a cold-blooded killer who deserved the maximum punishment, or a severely ill woman failed by the mental health system? Her trial began in 2002, and prosecutors sought the death penalty. Andrea pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Expert witnesses testified about her psychosis, while the state argued she knew her actions were wrong, pointing to the fact that she called police immediately afterward. Juries sided with the prosecution. Andrea Yates was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison, but her case was far from over. In 2005, an appeals court overturned the conviction after it was revealed that an expert witness had provided false testimony. Andrea was retried in 2006, and this time, the jury reached a different verdict. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed indefinitely to a high-security mental health facility. Yates remains there to this day. Andrea's case left the country divided. Some saw her as a calculating murderer, while others viewed her as a deeply broken woman whose pleas for help had gone unanswered. The tragedy also forced lawmakers and medical professionals to confront the devastating impact of postpartum depression and psychosis. It raised uncomfortable but necessary questions. Could the deaths of the Yates children have been prevented if Andrea had received consistent treatment? Should families bear more responsibility to heed doctors' warnings? Russell Yates, once a devoted husband, stood by Andrea for years, insisting she was sick rather than evil. But even his steadfast support couldn't undo the horror that had unfolded on June 20th, 2001. 5 innocent lives were lost in a single morning, and the shadow of that day still lingers today. Andrea remains confined to a mental health facility, far from the life she once envisioned as a wife, mother, and nurse. Her story is remembered not only as one of the most shocking family tragedies in American history, but also as a warning about what can happen when severe mental illness is left untreated. Both Crystal's case and Andrea's case highlight different sides of human darkness, one rooted in jealousy and control, the other in delusion and untreated illness, yet the result is the same. Families destroyed, children robbed of futures, and communities left to grapple with the haunting question of why. After a few days at home, Andrea's condition did not improve. She remained disoriented, withdrawn, and unable to care for her children. Concerned, Russell once again admitted her to Devereux Hospital, explaining to doctors that his wife was no longer responding to her medications. But just 45 days later, after displaying severe catatonic behavior and only 2 days after her last doctor's appointment, Andrea Yates did something far more devastating than attempting to take her own life. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, after Russell left for work, Andrea filled the bathtub with water. Then, one by one, she led each of her 5 children into the bathroom and drowned them. Her eldest, Noah, tried to resist, but Andrea forced his head underwater until he stopped breathing. With her youngest, 6-month-old, Mary Andrea placed the infant in her brother Luke's arms in the water, believing this act would reunite them in the afterlife. Once all 5 children were gone, Andrea gently laid their bodies on a bed, covering them with a blanket, as if they were simply sleeping. At 9:48 a.m., Andrea called 911, requesting a police officer at her home. The dispatcher pressed her for details, asking if she was ill, in danger, or suffering from abuse. Andrea calmly insisted that she simply needed the police. Her flat tone made the operator suspect domestic violence. 8 minutes later, at 9:56 a.m., Andrea called her husband Russell, urging him to come home. Alarmed, Russell rushed back when Officer Frank Stumpo arrived. Another officer was already on the scene and warned him that it was a homicide case entering the house. Stumpo saw Andrea sitting calmly on the couch, but when he entered the bedroom, he was shocked to find 4 children lying lifeless under a blanket. Then, in the bathroom, he discovered the 5th child floating in the tub. Andrea had killed them. Alondria was immediately taken into custody. She offered no denial, freely admitting she drowned her children. But investigators were left with one pressing question. Why would a mother kill her own kids? As doctors examined Andrea in custody, chilling details emerged. She confessed that she believed Satan had branded the number 666 on her scalp. She claimed the television had been speaking to her, and she was convinced she was a bad mother, destined to send her children to hell. Experts diagnosed Andrea with cocodamomania, a rare condition where a person believes they are possessed by demons. Andrea loved her children, but her psychosis, fueled by religious delusions and apocalyptic fears, convinced her that drowning them was the only way to save them from eternal damnation. Her disturbing beliefs were also influenced by the writings of preacher Michael Warnitsky, whose strict teachings about sin and damnation had deeply affected her. Andrea came to believe her sons would grow up to be evil, a serial killer, a prostitute, sinners destined for hell. In her mind, killing them was an act of salvation. When news of the crime broke, it spread across the nation. The name Andrea Yates was everywhere, and so was the question, what is postpartum psychosis? Her attorney, George Parnham, knew her only chance was to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, but as her trial loomed, the public grew divided. Many saw Andrea as a cold-blooded killer. Others believed she was a desperately ill woman who had been failed by her husband, doctors, and the system meant to protect her. Russell Yates came under fire. He defended Andrea publicly, insisting she was not herself and did not deserve punishment. He called her a loving mother who had been overtaken by mental illness. His calm demeanor after the murders and his defense of his wife outraged many, who accused him of lacking proper grief, or worse, of being complicit. Andrea was placed in the jail's medical ward and treated for psychosis. By September 22, 2001, 3 months after the killings, she was declared competent to stand trial. When her trial began, the state of Texas made it clear they would prosecute Andrea Yates to the fullest extent of the law. The trial began in February 2002, and the prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. Their opening statement painted Andrea Yates as a cold-blooded killer who had methodically drowned each of her children, one by one. In an act that could never be excused by mental illness alone, they emphasized that she had waited until her husband left for work, filled the bathtub, and carried out her plan in silence. Proof, they argued, that she was fully aware of her actions. The defense, led by George Parnham, took the opposite approach from the very beginning. Parnham told the jury that Andrea's actions were the tragic result of untreated postpartum psychosis, a rare but devastating mental illness that robbed her of rational thought. He argued that Andrea truly believed she was saving her children's souls from eternal damnation, not murdering them. Throughout the trial, Andrea's demeanor shocked many in the courtroom. She appeared emotionless, withdrawn, often staring into the distance. When asked directly why she had drowned her children, Andrea calmly explained that she believed she was a bad mother, that Satan was inside her, and that killing her children was the only way to protect them from hell. The testimony from medical experts was equally chilling. Several psychiatrists testified that Andrea was deeply psychotic and suffering from religious delusions at the time of the killings. They described how she heard voices from the television, believed numbers were branded into her scalp, and thought her children were destined for a life of sin and eternal suffering unless she acted. The prosecution countered by pointing to Andrea's actions after the murders, calling 911, phoning her husband, and speaking coherently with police. They argued these were signs she knew right from wrong after weeks of testimony. The jury rejected the insanity defense in March 2002. Andrea Yates was convicted of capital murder, however, instead of receiving the death penalty. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. After 40 years, the verdict divided the nation. Some believed justice had been served, while others felt the system had failed a severely mentally ill woman who desperately needed treatment, not punishment. But the story didn't end there in 2006. Andrea's conviction was overturned on appeal after it was revealed that a prosecution witness had given false testimony. She was retried, and this time, the jury reached a different conclusion. Andrea Yates was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a high-security mental health facility in Texas, where she remains to this day. Her case left an indelible mark on both the legal and medical fields. It forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about postpartum psychosis, the limits of criminal responsibility, and how justice should be applied when mental illness plays such a central role in a crime. Prosecutors made their intentions clear from the start. They wanted the death penalty for Andrea Yates, who had murdered her 5 children. They also hinted at Russell Yates's role in the tragedy, arguing that his decision to confine the family to a converted bus and insist on homeschooling had worsened Andrea's fragile mental state. Andrea's trial, officially, began in February 2002. Her defense team entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, a strategy rarely successful but, in their view, her only chance. They aimed to prove that Andrea was among the few who truly had no control over her actions because of severe mental illness. Both sides brought in high-profile psychiatrists to strengthen their cases. The prosecution relied on Dr. Park Dietz, while the defense called on Dr. Philip Resnick. Strikingly, both experts agreed on certain points. Andrea drowned her children while suffering from multiple psychiatric disorders, and she believed, at least in her mind, that her actions were in the children's best interests. But there was one crucial difference. Dr. Resnick testified that Andrea's delusions left her incapable of rational decision-making, while Dr. Dietz insisted that despite her psychosis, she still knew her actions were criminal. In his words, Andrea believed she was doing the right thing for her children, even though she knew society and the law would condemn it. Dietz also made a stunning claim that Andrea had drawn inspiration from an episode of Law and Order, in which a woman kills her children by drowning them and escapes punishment. He suggested Andrea may have thought she could do the same. The prosecution leaned heavily on this testimony, portraying Andrea as a woman who not only killed her children, but did so with calculation. They argued there was a method to her madness, that this was not only illegal, but immoral, a crime against society and against God. Russell Yates and his family, however, shifted blame toward Andrea's psychiatrist, Dr. Saeed, claiming he had improperly prescribed antidepressants and worsened her condition. Just days before the tragedy, the trial lasted 3 weeks. On March 15, 2002, after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of capital murder. The prosecution's request for the death penalty was denied, but Andrea was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 40 years. She was sent to the Mount View unit in Texas, a psychiatric facility for criminally insane convicts. Years later, in August 2004, Russell officially filed for divorce. Citing the irreparable devastation of their family, it was finalized in March 2005. And by the following year, Russell had remarried, but Andrea's legal battle was far from over. Soon after the conviction, journalists began to scrutinize Dr. Dietz's Law and Order testimony. To everyone's shock, it was revealed that no such episode of the show had ever existed. NBC reporter and author Suzanne O'Malley, who had written for Law and Order, confirmed that Dietz's claim was false. Even the show's creator, Dick Wolf, personally confirmed it had never aired, nor had it ever been written. This revelation gave Andrea's defense team a lifeline. Attorney George Parnham filed for a mistrial. Though it was initially denied, he then prepared an appeal, highlighting 19 separate errors. with DT's false testimony at the center. The breakthrough came in January 2005, when the Texas Court of Appeals ruled that although double jeopardy did not apply, Andrea deserved a new trial because of the false testimony presented at the first in January 2006. Andrea once again entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. She was transferred from prison to Rusk State Hospital, where she awaited her second trial while receiving treatment. Her defense team also took a new approach in the public sphere. In interviews, they urged people to view Andrea not as a monster, but as a sixth victim of her own deteriorating mental illness. By June 2006, 5 years after the killings, her second trial began. This time, the defense focused sharply on two key points: Andrea's severe psychosis and her inability to comprehend the true wrongfulness of her actions. Public opinion had also softened by then, with more people acknowledging the devastating role of postpartum psychosis. The retrial lasted weeks, and when it ended, the jury deliberated for 3 full days in a rare move. The jurors requested to see photographs of the Yates children before reaching their final decision. In the evening of October 22, 2013, Diana Chisholm contacted the Danvers Police Department to report her 14-year-old son, Philip Chisholm, missing. She explained that Philip, a freshman at the local high school, had not returned home after school. Worried, Diana emphasized that Philip had recently moved from Tennessee and had never behaved like this before. The Danvers police moved quickly. They posted Philip's picture and description on social media and issued a reverse 911 call to local residents, asking for assistance in locating the teen. At the same time, another family in Danvers was also growing anxious. Colleen Ritt, a 24-year-old math teacher at Danvers High School, had not come home after work. Her parents knew immediately that something was wrong. Colleen was punctual, responsible, and never broke routine without informing her family. Later that night, Officer Neil Wee of the Danvers Police Department spotted a lone figure walking along a dark, isolated stretch of Route 1. It was 12:28 a.m., and the boy wearing shorts, a hoodie, and sneakers, despite the cold, stood out immediately. As Officer Wee approached, he realized it was Philip Chisholm. His demeanor was unsettling, blank, detached, and avoiding eye contact when asked where he lived. Philip calmly said he had nowhere to go and claimed he'd been wandering the streets for days, but the officer noted something odd. Philip didn't look disheveled or dirty, as someone truly homeless would. Concerned, we frisked Philip and felt something plastic in his pocket. When asked to empty it, Philip pulled out a driver's license, insurance card, and credit card, none of which belonged to him. They belonged to Colleen Ritzer. When questioned, Philip said he had found the card at a grocery store, but he couldn't name the location. That explanation immediately raised suspicion. At the station, Officer Wee began examining Philip's backpack. Inside, he found a woman's purse, female underwear, and a box cutter smeared with what appeared to be blood. Alarmed, he asked Philip whose blood it was. Philip's chilling reply: "The girls." We stepped out to make an urgent call to the department, leaving another officer with Philip. That officer gently pressed further, asking where the girl was. Philip responded in a flat, emotionless voice: "She's buried in the woods." When officers asked Philip if the blood on his clothing belonged to him, he simply replied, "No." The officer looked closer and noticed reddish-brown stains smeared across Philip's sweatshirt sleeves and a ski mask bunched around his neck. His clothing and sneakers were immediately seized as evidence while officers processed Philip. Officer Steve Baldassari was dispatched to Danvers High School to search for Colleen Ritzer. On arrival, he began gathering information from staff and waiting for the school's security camera footage, which would soon provide chilling insights into her final moments. Meanwhile, officers searching the school grounds uncovered disturbing clues: Colleen's bag, a recycling bin, shoes, and clothing scattered near a wooded running trail close to the student parking lot. Her personal belongings were also found tossed into nearby brush. The recycling bin, in particular, appeared to be smeared with blood inside the building. Another officer discovered what looked like blood in a second-floor women's bathroom just steps from Colleen's classroom. As Baldassari reviewed the school's CCTV footage, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He saw Colleen at 2:30 p.m., leaving her classroom and heading down the hall just seconds later. Philip Chisholm followed closely behind. Minutes later, Colleen was seen entering the second-floor women's bathroom. Philip slipped in right after her. Colleen never came back out. Instead, Philip emerged alone, dressed differently, and with a mask covering his face, as though attempting to conceal his identity. At 3:16 p.m., the footage showed him returning to the bathroom, this time wheeling in a recycling bin. Moments later, he dragged the bin back out and disappeared from the camera's view. By then, the Danvers Police Department had been informed that Philip was in custody. The Massachusetts State Police quickly took over and began a full-scale investigation at the station. Philip's mother, Diana Chisholm, was interviewed. She expressed concern about her son's mental health, explaining that he had been struggling with the stress of his parents' recent separation and that there was a history of mental illness in their family. Around 2 a.m., Diana and Philip were escorted into an interrogation room, where they briefly spoke in private before questioning began. Unbeknownst to them, officers just outside the room were piecing together the damning CCTV evidence during the interview. Investigators pressed Philip at first. He deflected, but eventually, he delivered a chilling confession. He had attacked Colleen with a karate-style blow to incapacitate her before slashing her neck twice with a box cutter. He even drew a map to show officers where her body could be found. Meanwhile, the state police air wing used infrared technology to scan the woods behind the school's search dogs, combed the area until just after 3 a.m. A forensic investigator spotted a toe with pink nail polish protruding from a pile of leaves. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but it was far too late. Colleen Ritzer's lifeless body was recovered and transported to the medical examiner's office. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. Anna MacDonald, revealed horrifying details. Male DNA found on Colleen's body matched Philip Chisholm. She had multiple petechial hemorrhages around her eyes and mouth, clear signs of asphyxiation. The box cutter retrieved from Philip's backpack carried Colleen's blood. Her injuries were brutal, at least 16 separate wounds to her neck, several of them fatal. One slash was so deep it chipped a vertebra. Dr. MacDonald concluded that Colleen's cause of death was sharp force injuries to the neck, combined with asphyxiation, as word spread through Danvers that Colleen had been murdered. Shock turned to horror when it was revealed that her killer was a 14-year-old student she had once taught. Philip Chisholm was charged with aggravated sexual assault and murder despite his age. He was tried as an adult, a decision that ignited heated debate. Some argued that his youth should shield him from the harshest penalties, while others insisted the sheer brutality of the crime demanded it for Colleen's students. The loss was unbearable. They remembered her as a warm, dedicated teacher who went beyond the classroom to care for their success. Her death left an empty space that no one could fill. The investigation into Colleen Ritzer's murder quickly transitioned into a high-profile court case, with overwhelming forensic evidence, CCTV footage, and Philip's own partial confession. Prosecutors were confident, but the trial would still be long and emotional. Philip was indicted on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated rape, and armed robbery, despite being only 14 at the time of the crime. Massachusetts law required that juveniles accused of murder be tried as adults. His defense team immediately challenged this, arguing that Philip's age and documented mental health struggles should mitigate his responsibility in the courtroom. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of premeditation. They showed the jury the CCTV footage frame by frame, Colleen walking toward the bathroom, Philip trailing her, and then re-emerging in different clothes with a mask. They also highlighted the recycling bin footage, hammering home the fact that Colleen was never seen alive again after she entered that bathroom. Experts testified that the blood on Philip's box cutter and clothing matched Colleen's DNA. The autopsy report, with its harrowing details of the deep neck wounds and signs of strangulation, was presented to the jury in stark, clinical language. The prosecution's narrative was clear. This was not a spontaneous outburst but a calculated, violent attack. The defense, on the other hand, focused on Philip's mental state. His mother, Diana, testified about the family's history of mental illness and the strain caused by her divorce. Psychiatric experts argued that Philip may have been suffering from a severe psychiatric disorder at the time of the killing, impairing his judgment and impulse control. They described him as a troubled, isolated boy who snapped under emotional pressure, but the prosecution countered that Philip's actions after the murder, changing clothes, using a recycling bin to move the body, and attempting to cover his tracks, proved he understood exactly what he was doing. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict in December 2015, guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of armed robbery, not guilty of aggravated rape. Due to insufficient evidence, the courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Colleen's family wept quietly, holding each other for support at sentencing. The judge faced a difficult decision because Philip was a juvenile at the time of the crime. He could not be sentenced to life without parole. Instead, he received life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, plus an additional 40 years for armed robbery. This meant Philip would likely spend most of his life behind bars, though technically there remained a chance for release for Colleen's family. The sentence could never undo their loss. They remembered her as a young teacher, just beginning her life's works, someone who dreamed of shaping students' futures but whose own future was stolen in an act of senseless brutality. Case left Danvers shaken and sparked ongoing debates about how the justice system should handle juvenile offenders who commit crimes of unimaginable violence. The pain of losing Colleen Ritzer was immeasurable. In the days following her murder, the Danvers community came together to grieve and honor her memory. Candlelight vigils were held. Students shared stories of her kindness, and even the Boston Red Sox paused before the opening game of the World Series to hold a moment of silence in her name. Her impact stretched far beyond the classroom, touching lives across Massachusetts and beyond. But as the community mourned, a haunting question lingered. What drove 14-year-old Philip Chisholm to assault and kill his teacher? According to reports, rumors circulated that Philip had developed an unhealthy fixation on Colleen. Some suggested that he misinterpreted her approachable and kind nature as something more, and when his advances were rejected, he snapped. A police source later told the media that Colleen's natural friendliness may have tragically led Philip to confuse compassion with affection. Meanwhile, classmates described Philip as increasingly withdrawn, antisocial, and out of it in the days leading up to the attack. Yet, no one could have predicted the darkness that was about to surface as Philip awaited trial. A judge dealt a blow to the prosecution by throwing out his confession, ruling that his Miranda rights had not been properly upheld. The court found that Philip had been held for hours without access to food or a phone call, and that his mother had clearly wanted an attorney present. Despite this setback, prosecutors still had overwhelming evidence: Colleen's blood on Philip's clothing, the box cutter, and the damning school surveillance footage. The trial began in December 2015. Essex County Assistant District Attorney Kate McDougal presented the state's case, arguing that Philip's actions were deliberate and methodical. She described how he followed Colleen into the second-floor bathroom, waited, changed his appearance, and then tried to cover his tracks. McDougal maintained that this was not the work of an insane mind, but of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The defense, led by Denise Regan, painted a very different picture. She argued that Philip was in the throes of psychosis, tormented by hallucinations and delusions. To support this, the defense called Dr. Anthony Jackson, a forensic psychiatrist, who testified that Philip's condition improved significantly once he began taking antipsychotic medication. And the key expert, Dr. Richard Dudley, testified for the prosecution, but acknowledged Philip's disturbing mental health history. He revealed that Philip had heard voices and believed a ninja was present during the attack, suggesting schizophrenia had shaped his distorted reality according to Dr. Dudley. Philip had shown signs of being on the schizophrenia spectrum since childhood, and his mental state had deteriorated dramatically in the months before the murder. The courtroom listened as psychiatric terms delusions, psychosis were weighed against stark, undeniable facts: Colleen's injuries, the CCTV footage, and Philip's chilling behavior. After the crime, prosecutors argued that even if Philip struggled with mental illness, his actions were too calculated to be dismissed as uncontrollable. Were shown graphic crime scene photos and even taken on a tour of Danvers High School to see the bathroom where Colleen had been attacked. It was a sobering moment, grounding the horror of the crime in a place once filled with everyday routine. Defense tried to sway the jury by presenting testimony from Philip's family. His grandfather described a long history of mental illness in the family, including Philip's grandmother's breakdown in the 1970s that required electroshock therapy. A classmate also recalled how Philip had changed dramatically in the weeks before Colleen's death, becoming quiet and withdrawn after once being outgoing, but in the end, the evidence was overwhelming despite the arguments about his mental health. The jury found Philip guilty of first-degree murder and armed robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The judge described death as both brutal and senseless, a crime that had shattered countless lives. One might have thought that would be the last the world would hear of Philip Chisholm, but it wasn't. In 2014, while awaiting trial, Philip committed another shocking act behind bars. At just 15 years old, he lured a female staff member at the Department of Youth Services into a bathroom, attacked her, and attempted to strangle her with a pencil. Miraculously, she survived. Years later, in 2017, Philip pleaded guilty to attempted murder, assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, and kidnapping, earning him additional decades on top of his original life sentence. For Colleen's family, the pain of her loss never faded. She was remembered not just as a victim, but as a devoted teacher, daughter, and friend, someone whose life's work was cut tragically short by a student she only wanted to help. Fresh start, something far away from Tennessee, and Jason's advertisement seemed like the perfect opportunity. In 2008, Molly packed her bags and moved across the Atlantic to Ireland to help Jason raise Jack and Sarat first. Molly appeared to be everything Jason needed: kind, patient, and eager to bond with the children. But in truth, Molly was searching for more than just a nanny position. She wanted a family of her own. And soon, she began envisioning herself not just as Jack and Sarah's caretaker, but as Jason's partner. Over time, their relationship grew from professional to personal. Jason, still grieving the loss of Mags, found comfort in Molly's companionship. By 2011, they were married in a small ceremony, and Molly officially became stepmother to Jack and Sarah, two outsiders. The Corbett family seemed happy. Jason had found love again, and the children had a maternal figure in their lives. But behind closed doors, tension simmered. Friends and family back in Ireland noticed changes in Jason. Once confident and outgoing, he seemed more withdrawn, cautious with his words, and often stressed. Jason's sister Tracy, especially, grew concerned. She claimed Jason confided in her that Molly was controlling, manipulative, and obsessed with keeping him to herself. Jason allegedly told Tracy that he wanted to leave Molly, but feared losing custody of his children if he did. According to those close to him, Jason had even begun exploring the legal steps necessary to protect Jack and Sarah should he move forward with a separation. In August 2015, everything came to a violent and tragic end inside the Corbett home in North Carolina, where the family had relocated to live closer to Molly's parents. On the night of August 2nd, Jason was bludgeoned to death in the master bedroom. The weapons, a baseball bat and a paving brick. The perpetrators, his wife, Molly Martins, and her father, Thomas Martins, a retired FBI agent. Molly and Thomas claimed, telling police that Jason had been choking Molly and that they acted to save her life, but prosecutors painted a very different picture, that the killing was deliberate, fueled by Molly's resentment and desire to control Jason's life and children. The brutality of the attack shocked investigators. Jason suffered multiple blows to the head, leaving behind a blood-soaked scene that spoke more of rage than of self-defense. The case unfolded. The trial exposed years of marital conflict, accusations of emotional manipulation, and questions about Molly's true intentions from the moment she answered Jason's ad all those years ago. The trial of Molly Martins and her father, Thomas Martins, began in 2017 in Davidson County, North Carolina. From the very beginning, it was clear this case would be as much about character as it was about the crime itself. The prosecution argued that Jason had been planning to leave Molly and return to Ireland with his children, a decision Molly could not accept. They painted a picture of a woman desperate to keep control, aided by a father who would do anything to protect his daughter, even if it meant taking a man's life. The evidence supported the prosecution's version. Jason's blood was found spattered throughout the bedroom, and the sheer number of blows, at least 10 to the head, suggested far more force than necessary for self-defense. Prosecutors argued the killing was not a sudden struggle, but a sustained, brutal attack. The defense, however, clung to the self-defense narrative. Molly testified that Jason had been physically and emotionally abusive, and that on the night of the killing he had strangled her. Thomas, stepping into the role of the protective father, told the court he struck Jason only to save his daughter's life. But the jury was not convinced. After deliberation, both Molly and Thomas Martins were found guilty of second-degree murder. Each received a prison sentence of 20 to 25 years for Jason's family in Ireland. The verdict was a bittersweet moment. His sister Tracy, who had long suspected Molly's manipulations, wept in the courtroom. She later said it was the first step in honoring Jason's memory and ensuring his children knew the truth about what happened to their father. Yet, the story did not end there. In the years following the conviction, Molly and Thomas appealed, arguing that evidence of Jason's alleged abusive behavior had been unfairly excluded from the trial. In 2021, the North Carolina Supreme Court ordered a retrial, stunning Jason's family and reopening old wounds. Finally, in 2022, rather than risk a new trial with uncertain outcomes, both Molly and Thomas accepted plea deals. They pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, dramatically reducing their sentences to 7 to 20 years. By that time, they had already served 5 for Jason's loved ones. The reduced convictions felt like a crushing blow. His sister Tracy called the plea bargain a betrayal of justice, believing that the violent, deliberate nature of Jason's death had been minimized. Jack and Sarah, Jason's children, were returned to Ireland, where they were raised by Jason's family. They grew up carrying the weight of a tragedy that forever changed the course of their young lives. Jason Corbett's story is remembered as one of love, loss, and betrayal, a widower who rebuilt his life after tragedy, only to fall victim to a second, even darker one. Molly Martins arrived in Limerick in March 2008, eager for a fresh start and excited to begin her new adventure as an au pair. From the moment she met little Jack and Sarah, her warmth and natural affection for children shone through. Jason couldn't help but notice how easily his kids connected with her, and how her presence brought a sense of calm to their grieving homes. Time passed. The relationship between Jason and Molly blossomed. What began as a professional arrangement slowly grew into something deeper, and soon, those around Jason noticed how much lighter and happier he seemed. The once devastated widower appeared to have found joy again. On Valentine's Day 2010, Jason proposed to Molly at one of their favorite restaurants in Limerick, surrounded by family and friends. The couple celebrated their engagement with champagne and laughter, Molly eagerly stepped into the role of a future wife and mother, treating Jack and Sarah as though they were her own. But when Jason's loved ones flew to America for the wedding, cracks began to show. The Molly they had come to know in Ireland seemed to have vanished instead of the radiant bride-to-be. She appeared moody, withdrawn, and controlling throughout the wedding weekend. She rarely left her room, leaving Jason's family puzzled and uneasy. Then came a disturbing revelation. One of the bridesmaids confided to Jason's relatives that Molly had claimed she'd once been close friends with Mags, Jason's late wife, and that Mags had died of cancer. Jason's sister Tracy was stunned. She knew the truth. Mags had died from an asthma attack, and Molly had never even met her. The lies shook Jason's family deeply. Tracy and several friends warned Jason that it wasn't too late to walk away, but Jason stood firm. He had made a commitment, and he was going to keep it. The wedding went ahead as planned, but a shadow of doubt lingered after the ceremony. Jason and Molly settled with Jack and Sarah in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. From the outside, they looked like the perfect blended family. Molly slipped into her new life, and Jason appeared content. But behind closed doors, unease began to build. Jason confided in his sister that he longed to return to Ireland. He missed the rugby, the culture, and the community that had shaped him. Winston-Salem was fine, but it wasn't home. He wanted his children raised as teenagers in Ireland, surrounded by their heritage. While Jason acknowledged that Molly had been the only mother figure his children had ever known, he refused to let her adopt them. He had growing concerns about her erratic behavior and her strange lies about Mags. By 2015, the tension between them had reached its breaking point. In the early hours of August 2nd, 2015, Molly's father, Tom Martins, a retired FBI agent with 3 decades of experience, dialed 911. His voice was steady as he told the dispatcher that his daughter and Jason had been involved in a violent altercation. What unfolded next would leave Jason's family shattered forever. When Tom Martins dialed 911 in the early hours of August 2nd, 2015, his voice was steady, but his words were chilling. He told the dispatcher that he had stepped in to protect his daughter, Molly, from her husband Jason Corbett. When asked what he meant by bad shape, Tom calmly admitted, "I think I may have killed him." Police and paramedics rushed to the Corbett home in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Inside the master bedroom, they found Jason lying lifeless. Both Molly and her father were covered in blood. Detectives immediately separated them for questioning. Tom claimed that earlier in the night, he had heard a violent struggle upstairs. Fearing for his daughter's safety, he grabbed a metal Little League baseball bat, a gift he had once bought for Jason's son, Jack, and went to investigate. He alleged that when he entered the bedroom, Jason had his hands wrapped around Molly's throat. According to Tom, Jason ignored repeated demands to let her go, allegedly growling, "I'm going to kill her." Tom told detectives that his instincts as a father kicked in. He swung the bat at Jason, but Jason, much larger and stronger, wrestled the bat away and shoved Tom so forcefully that his glasses flew across the room. Tom claimed he feared Jason would kill both him and Molly when he managed to regain control of the bat. He said he struck Jason repeatedly until Jason finally went down. During the interview, Tom described Jason as crazy. Strikingly, detectives noted that Tom seemed relaxed, even jovial, answering questions about the fatal encounter as though it were routine. In another room, Molly gave her own account. Her story echoed her father's version, but with one addition. She said she had picked up a paving stone from her nightstand and struck Jason with it as he attacked Tom. When pressed about why she had a paving stone in her bedroom, Molly said she and the children had been planning a landscaping project around the mailbox after photographs of their injuries were taken. Both Molly and Tom were released back in Ireland. Jason's sister, Tracy, received the devastating news. Her grief quickly turned to disbelief when she learned Jason had allegedly been killed in self-defense by his wife and father-in-law. She knew her brother's nature, gentle, kind, and incapable of violence. Tracy was convinced something was terribly wrong. Desperate to protect Jason's children, Jack and Sarah, She attempted to reach Molly, but her calls and messages went unanswered instead. Molly moved swiftly, filing for custody of the children and claiming Jason had been abusive throughout their marriage. Molly told friends that Jason controlled her, belittled her, and even forced her into sex against her will, but she had never once filed a police report or sought help. Tracy, who knew her brother better than anyone, was certain these were lies designed to protect Molly from suspicion. Her fears deepened when she learned that Jack and Sarah, then 10 and 8 years old, had been interviewed by social workers. Shockingly, both children repeated Molly's claims, even stating they had witnessed Jason abusing her. To Tracy, it was clear someone had coached them, determined not to lose her niece and nephew. Tracy flew to North Carolina and filed for custody after a tense legal battle. The court sided with her, removing the children from Molly's care and placing them with their aunt. Jason's body was repatriated to Ireland with the help of the Kevin Bell Repatriation Trust, a charity dedicated to assisting families in bringing loved ones home after tragedy abroad. 2 weeks later, Tracy returned to Limerick with Jack and Sarah, carrying both their grief and their father's remains. Molly, meanwhile, was devastated by the court's ruling. She bombarded Jack and Sarah with calls and messages, often resorting to Facebook posts, begging mutual friends to pass along her words, but Tracy held firm to her. Molly had forfeited the right to see the children the moment she killed Jason. When the autopsy results came back, they told a very different story from the one Molly and Tom had spun. Jason had suffered over a dozen blows to the head, far more than could be justified as self-defense. Detectives who had initially treated the case as a domestic dispute gone wrong now saw signs of something much darker. 5 months later, both Molly and Tom were arrested and charged with second-degree murder for Jason's family. It was a moment of relief. Long-awaited justice finally seemed within reach. Investigators soon uncovered a trove of evidence suggesting the killing was not spontaneous, but premeditated. Among the most telling were recordings of heated arguments between Jason and Molly. Detectives believed these were deliberately staged attempts to paint Jason as abusive and volatile, laying the groundwork for a self-defense claim if things ever escalated to Jason's loved ones. The motive was clear. He had been planning to return to Ireland with Jack and Sarah, leaving Molly behind. For Molly, losing Jason meant losing the only family she had built for herself in America, and when Jason threatened to take the children back to Ireland, she and her father decided to ensure that never happened. After the custody battle, it became clear that Molly had hoped to use recordings against Jason in court, but in Limerick, Jack and Sarah began to heal under the care of their Aunt Tracy. They settled into a new routine and started therapy. 9 months later, Jack revealed a truth that stunned everyone. He recanted the statement he had made to social workers in the days after his father's death. Jack admitted that Molly had fabricated the stories of abuse she had pressured him, warning that if he didn't lie, he and Sarah would never see her again. The weight of that manipulation stayed with him until, finally, he found the courage to speak up, because he wanted justice for his father. When Molly and Tom finally stood trial, prosecutors laid out their case in painstaking detail. They argued that neither Molly nor Tom bore any injuries consistent with fighting off a man of Jason's size. The absence of bruises or cuts strongly suggested there had been no desperate struggle. Instead, experts testified Jason had been ambushed. A bloodspatter analyst painted a damning picture. Jason was struck while defenseless, with Tom towering over him, swinging the Little League baseball bat again and again. The brutal force of the blows told the story of intent, not survival. The prosecution also introduced a financial motive in the event of Jason's death. Molly stood to gain $600,000 from his life insurance policy. It was another thread woven into the theory that this was not self-defense, but a planned killing. The defense countered. They displayed a photo of Molly taken that night, showing a faint red mark on her neck. Their experts insisted it was consistent with strangulation, citing scratches behind her ears, complaints of difficulty swallowing, and a sore throat. They even claimed Molly urinated during the attack. a common phenomenon when someone loses consciousness from being choked. Nurse practitioner added another layer, testifying that Jason had confided in her about sudden outbursts of anger. Just 2 weeks before his death, the defense argued this suggested volatility and danger in his behavior. Tom himself took the stand, calm but resolute. He told the jury he feared for his daughter's life, and his own once he regained the bat from Jason. He admitted he hit Jason until the threat was over, but in the prosecution's closing argument, they made a move designed to leave a lasting impact. The baseball bat and the paving stone were placed before the jury, tangible, blood-stained reminders of the violence that ended Jason's life after 9 days of testimony. The jury needed just 3 hours. The verdict was guilty. Both Molly and Tom were convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 to 25 years in prison. As Molly was led away, she turned to her mother and whispered through tears, "I'm so sorry. I should have just let him kill me." But the story didn't end there. In 2020, the appeals court overturned the convictions, ruling that key evidence had been unfairly excluded. The North Carolina Supreme Court upheld the decision the following year, and both Molly and Tom were released on bail while awaiting a retrial in pretrial hearings. Their defense launched shocking accusations, suggesting Jason's first wife, Mags, who died of an asthma attack in 2006, may actually have been strangled, but investigators quickly dismissed the claim. No evidence ever supported foul play, and Jason had never been considered a suspect in her death. Eventually, facing another grueling trial, Molly and Tom struck a plea deal. They admitted guilt to voluntary manslaughter, and the murder charges were dropped. Their sentence, a minimum of 51 months, with credit for time served. They walked free in June 2024 for Jason's family. The release was devastating. Old wounds were torn open, and anger boiled over. His children, now teenagers, spoke at the sentencing hearing, their words cutting, and Rojak and Sarah described Molly as a manipulative monster, a woman who had abused them, lied about their father, and forced them into her scheme. Sarah's words were particularly searing. She accused Molly of stealing not only her father's life, but also her childhood. Molly, in contrast, expressed regret. She told the court she lived with remorse every day, that she wished she could undo what had happened, but for Jack and Sarah, her words meant nothing. As Sarah put it, no apology could ever give her back her father. In the end, what could have been a story of family and love curdled into betrayal, manipulation, and tragedy. It's a haunting reminder that behind closed doors, even the most picture-perfect families can hide darkness capable of destroying everything. The intersection erupted in chaos. Stephen fired repeatedly into the pickup truck, bullets shattering the windows and tearing through the vehicle inside. Katie and her adoptive father, Anthony Fusco, never stood a chance. Both were killed instantly, their lives cut short in a hail of gun attacks stunned onlookers. Witnesses recalled the deafening sound of rapid gunfire and the sight of the truck lurching forward before coming to a stop. Some thought it was a random act of road rage, but the truth was far more sinister. After murdering Katie and Anthony, Stephen fled the scene in his minivan. Panic spread quickly through the neighborhood, with police rushing to lock down the area. The manhunt for Stephen Plattle was swift and intense. Years later, Stephen's vehicle was located in Dover, New York, just a few miles from where he had carried out the killings. Inside, officers found him slumped over the steering wheel. He had turned the gun on himself, ending his life. The chain of violence was complete in the span of just 24 hours. Stephen had murdered his infant son, his daughter-turned-wife, her adoptive father, and then himself. Her lives lost, and countless others shattered. In the fallout, news of the killings spread quickly, sparking outrage and disbelief. How had a man been allowed to manipulate his own daughter into such a relationship? Why hadn't the warning signs, the journal entries, the police reports, the incest charges been enough to prevent this tragedy? For Alyssa, Stephen's ex-wife, and the mother of his first 2 daughters, the events were devastating. She had long warned authorities about Stephen's instability, but her worst fears had still come true. She later described the murders as a nightmare. She could never wake from the lives of her daughters, forever scarred by their fathers' actions. The case of Stephen Plattle stands as one of the most disturbing intersections of obsession, manipulation, and violence, a story where love was twisted into control, where boundaries were erased, and where rejection became the spark for unimaginable bloodshed in the aftermath. Investigators tried to piece together the psychology behind Stephen's spiral. Experts described it as a case of genetic sexual attraction, a phenomenon where estranged biological relatives sometimes mistake a sense of familiarity for intimacy when reunited as adults. But in Stephen's case, it wasn't just biology, it was control. He had groomed Katie from the moment she entered his life, twisting fatherly responsibility into something predatory and dangerous. Katie, just 18 when she reconnected with her birth parents, had been vulnerable, searching for identity and belonging. Stephen exploited that need, shaping her world until she believed their relationship was normal, even sacred. But when Katie finally recognized the truth and tried to reclaim her life, Stephen responded the only way he knew how, with violence. The crime was not just the murder of a child, a daughter, and a father-in-law. It was the annihilation of boundaries, the collapse of family, and the ultimate expression of control. In the end, Stephen Plattle ensured that if he could not possess Katie, no one could. The blood trail he left behind became his final, horrific legacy, and, like so many of these cases, the whispers of warning had always been there, ignored, overlooked, or dismissed until it was too late. In April 2018, a nightmare unfolded across 3 states, leaving a trail of devastation no one could have imagined. It began in New Milford, Connecticut. The quiet morning calm was shattered when gunfire erupted at an intersection. Behind the wheel of a Toyota pickup sat 20-year-old Katie Plattle and her adoptive father, 56-year-old Anthony Fusco. In a blur of violence, a blue minivan pulled alongside them, and its driver, Katie's biological father and secret husband, 42-year-old Stephen Plattle, unleashed a hail of bullets from an AR-15 style rifle. Both victims were struck multiple times in the head and torso, killed instantly before they even had a chance to react. Witnesses described the chaos and horror. One of them, an off-duty firefighter, who frantically called 911, his voice shaking as he reported, "Somebody just drove by shooting into that truck." The shooter was gone, but his identity was no mystery. Hours earlier, Stephen had phoned his mother, Grace. In a chilling confession, his words revealed not only the double murder, but something far darker. He admitted he had already killed his 7-month-old son, Bennett, at his home in Knightdale, North Carolina. When police rushed to Stephen's house, they found the infant's tiny body hidden inside a closet. The cause of death: asphyxiation with compression of the torso, a deliberate, brutal act of filicide. By then, Stephen was already on the run. His blue minivan was tracked across state lines into Dover, New York, where officers later discovered it parked in a secluded lot. Inside sat Stephen's lifeless body. He had turned the gun on himself, ending the spree with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The investigation painted a harrowing picture of how the family had unraveled months earlier. Stephen and Katie had been arrested on charges of incest, adultery, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor after their secret relationship came to light. Released on bail under strict orders to avoid contact, both defied the restrictions, continuing their relationship in secrecy. Katie's mother and Stephen's ex-wife, Alyssa, had tried to raise alarms. She believed the courts had failed her daughter and her grandson, pointing out that Stephen was never subjected to a psychiatric evaluation. In her own words, "If anyone is charged with incest, they should never be allowed around minor children." Legal experts called the case unprecedented. Stephen's attorney argued that the relationship was consensual, ignoring the disturbing power dynamics that had shaped it. The reality was clear. Katie had been groomed and manipulated from the moment she reunited with her father at 18 years old. What followed was a toxic cycle of control, obsession, and ultimately destruction. In the end, 3 innocent lives were lost. Anthony Fusco, a loving father, baby Bennett, who never had a chance at life, and Katie herself, whose search for identity ended in tragedy. The story of Stephen and Katie Plattles sent shockwaves through communities and headlines worldwide. It remains a chilling reminder of how abuse can hide behind closed doors, how manipulation can masquerade as love, and how dangerous the consequences become when warnings are ignored. This was not just a crime of passion, it was the collapse of family, morality, and reason itself, a descent so twisted it could only end in blood. The murders and Stephen's final act of suicide left the world questioning how manipulation, obsession, and abuse could spiral into such unthinkable violence. Many criticized the justice system for its failure to protect the innocent, especially when the warning signs had been so painfully clear. Katie's biological mother, Alyssa Plattle, emerged as a voice for the victims, speaking openly about the systemic failures that allowed this tragedy to unfold. She urged society to learn from what had happened, to recognize the dangers of unchecked abuse, to demand stronger protections, and to ensure proper mental health evaluations for those who pose a risk to others. The disturbing case of Stephen and Katie Plattle soon gained national attention, featured in the true crime series Sex, Lies and Murder. In an episode titled Murders in the Family, it examined not only the incestuous relationship at the center of the case, but also the long shadow of Stephen's manipulative and abusive behavior through chilling reenactments and interviews. The episode shed light on the turmoil endured by the victims, and the systemic cracks that allowed such darkness to fester in the end. This case stands as a grim reminder: when abuse goes unnoticed or ignored, the consequences can be catastrophic. As the rain falls softly outside and the night grows still. Thank you for joining me here at Crime Whispers. These stories remind us of life's darkest mysteries, and of the importance of awareness, even in the quiet hours. If tonight's tale has held you close, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the rain guide you into rest. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night keep its watch over youth. Case of Stephen and Katie Plattle is more than a story of crime. It is a grim portrait of how manipulation, secrecy, and unchecked abuse can warp the most sacred of human bonds. A father and daughter, roles meant to embody love, care, and protection, instead collapsed into a twisted imitation of intimacy, a relationship born of control and grooming the result. A tragedy that claimed 4 lives and left an entire community grasping for answers. To truly understand how the story reached such a catastrophic end, we must go back to the beginning. Seeds of control. Stephen Plattle's patterns of abuse began long before Katie was born. His relationship with Alyssa Garcia was rooted in imbalance. He was 20. She was only 15. The power difference between them was obvious. But Alyssa was a teenager, swept away by what she believed was love. What she couldn't see then was the web Stephen was weaving around her, a web that would entrap not only her, but also her unborn child. Katie, born Denise in 1998, never had a chance to know a safe childhood in Stephen's presence. Alyssa remembers his violence vividly, the bruises on Katie's infant body, the terrifying moments when her baby was stuffed into a cooler, struggling for air. These were not isolated acts. They were the early evidence of Stephen's controlling, abusive personality, a foreshadowing of the darkness that lay ahead. Alyssa made the most painful choice a mother can make: to give her daughter up for adoption, not because she didn't love her, but because she loved her too much to let her remain in harm's way. Katie was adopted by the Fusco family, a family who cherished her, gave her stability, and protected her from the shadows of her biological father. But fate has a cruel way of circling back the reunion. By the time Katie was a young adult, she longed for answers about her origins. Like many adoptees, she wanted to know where she came from, who her parents were, and what pieces of her identity were hidden in the past. Through social media, she found Alyssa. Their reunion was emotional, bittersweet, and filled with hope for Alyssa. It was a second chance at a relationship with the daughter she had lost for Katie. It was the discovery of a mother who had never stopped loving Herb. With that reunion came another one that would unravel everything. Steven was still in Alyssa's orbit, living in the same house. Sleeping on the couch, he was separated from Alyssa, but still exerted his influence on the household. When Katie moved in during the summer of 2016, she unknowingly stepped into his sphere of control. Alyssa quickly saw the warning signs. Steven's behavior changed almost immediately. He styled himself differently, dressing younger, as though to blur the decades between himself and Katie. Before long, Alyssa discovered that Steven was no longer sleeping on the couch, but instead on the floor of Katie's bedroom. The dynamic was no longer just concerning, it was dangerous. Alyssa confronted them both, but Katie dismissed her concerns, convinced she was safe. That, in itself, was proof of Steven's manipulation. He had already begun to reshape her reality. The spiral into darkness. The bond between Steven and Katie deepened, morphing into something taboo and destructive. Alyssa's world fell apart when she discovered her younger daughter's journal. Inside were words no mother should ever have to read. Katie was pregnant, the father. Steven. The journal also revealed how the younger children were being manipulated into calling Katie their stepmother. The household had been rewritten into a distorted version of a family. When Alyssa confronted Steven, he admitted it, without shame. He claimed he was in love with Katie, that the rules of biology didn't matter. It was not love, it was the culmination of years of grooming, manipulation, and control. Despite the horror of the revelation, Steven and Katie doubled down. In July 2017, they traveled to Maryland, lied on their marriage documents, and became husband and wife. Steven's mother attended the ceremony. Katie's adoptive parents were there too, trapped between love for their daughter and helplessness in the face of her choices. A few months later, Katie gave birth to a baby boy, Bennett. The cracks formed. The union might have been legal on paper, but it was built on a foundation of secrecy and lies. In January 2018, Steven and Katie were arrested on charges of incest, adultery, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The courts released them on bond, but with strict conditions. They were to have no contact with each other. Custody of baby Bennett was given to Steven's mother, Grace. For the first time in years, distance came between Steven and Katie, and with distance came clarity. Katie returned to New York to live with her adoptive parents. She began to realize the toxic nature of her relationship with Steven. She wanted a fresh start, to go to college, to study art and digital advertising. She wanted her life back. In April 2018, she told Steven it was over. She wanted a divorce. Age unleashed for Steven. Rejection was not an option. Katie wasn't just his daughter in his warped mind. She was his possession. The thought of losing her sent him into a spiral of rage and despair. April 11th, 2018. Steven picked up baby Bennett, but instead of delivering him to Katie, as he told his mother he would, he smothered his infant son and hid his tiny body in a closet. The act was as deliberate as it was horrifying. A father killing his child out of spite and control. Then he drove 600 miles from North Carolina to New York, fueled not by love, but by vengeance. The final act. In the morning of April 12th, Katie and her adoptive father, Anthony Fusco, left their home in New Milford, Connecticut, unaware that death was following them at an intersection. Their truck stopped at a red light. Steven pulled up alongside in his blue minivan, raised his AR-15 style rifle, and opened fire. Witnesses described the eruption of gunfire, the sound of bullets tearing through metal and glass, the sight of two lives extinguished in an instant. Katie was just 20 years old. Anthony was 56. Both died, strapped in their seats. Unable to escape the ambush, Steven fled the scene, but not before confessing to his mother in a phone call. He admitted to killing Katie, to killing Anthony, and to murdering his own son hours later. In a lonely spot in New York, he turned the gun on himself. Aftermath and outrage. The aftermath was a storm of grief and outrage, for lives lost in a span of hours. Katie, Anthony, Bennett, and Stephen himself. The Fusco family mourned the daughter they had raised, the man who had loved her like his own, and the grandson they would never get to watch grow. Alyssa mourned the child she had given up to save, only to lose in the most unthinkable way, and the public mourned till shockwaves rippled across the nation as the story unfolded. Commentators demanded to know, how could the system have failed so badly? Stephen had been charged with incest, he had a history of violence, and yet he had access to his infant son. He was not evaluated for mental health risks. The warnings were there, but no one acted in time. The legacy today. The story of Stephen and Katie Plattel is more than a headline. It is a case study in how abuse, unchecked, can metastasize into tragedy. Shows us how grooming can warp reality, how control can masquerade as love, and how systems meant to protect the vulnerable can sometimes fail. For Alyssa, survival meant speaking out. She has since become an advocate for awareness of domestic abuse and manipulation, reminding the world that silence is dangerous and vigilance is vital. And for the rest of us, this story lingers in our minds, a chilling reminder of how fragile life is and how darkness can hide even in the places we expect to be safest. Our family's shadows of the mind. To understand Stephen, one must step into the labyrinth of his mind. He wasn't simply a father who crossed boundaries. He was a man who blurred them entirely from the outside. People described him as quiet, introverted, even awkward, but beneath that surface lived a storm of obsession, control, and unchecked desire. He had been abusive with Alyssa long before Katie re-entered his life. He controlled her clothing, her friendships, her movements. He isolated her, as abusers often do, making her world revolve solely around him. And when Katie appeared, it was as if Stephen saw not a daughter, but an opportunity to mold someone new, someone he could own completely. Psychologists later suggested that Stephen displayed traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder. He demanded adoration, expected obedience, and when those were denied, he lashed out in destructive ways to him. Katie wasn't just a partner, she was proof that he could rewrite reality, proof that he could bend social norms, legal structures, and even bloodlines to his will. But reality has limits, and when those limits closed in, Stephen's control turned lethal. Katie's life before the storm. Katie's life with the Fuscos was stable, filled with love. She was quiet, creative, and often retreated into her art. She sketched, painted, and later pursued digital media. In college, friends described her as compassionate, almost gentle to a fault. She had dreams of advertising work, of one day living in New York City, of using her creativity to make her mark. When she first sought out her birth parents, her intentions were simple. She wanted to know them. She wanted to understand her roots. Like so many adoptees, it wasn't about replacing the family she had, but about filling the empty spaces in her identity. She never imagined that the father she met would see her not as a daughter, but as something else entirely. The law's blind spot. Incest is illegal in all 50 U.S. states, but enforcement varies widely. In North Carolina, where Stephen and Katie lived, it is a felony offense, yet proving it often depends on confession or physical evidence. In this case, the evidence was clear. They had a child together when authorities arrested them in early 2018. Many expected swift, harsh consequences, yet both were released on bond. Critics later asked, why? Why allow a man with a history of violence to remain free, especially when a child was involved? Legal experts pointed out that the system often underestimates the dangers of incestuous relationships, viewing them as moral or taboo issues rather than matters of life and death. In this case, the consequences of that oversight became devastatingly clear. The community's silenced. Neighbors in Knightdale, North Carolina, had noticed strange dynamics at the Plattel household. They saw Katie arrive in 2016, a young woman living with her biological father. They noticed how quickly she became pregnant, how Stephen referred to her not as his daughter, but as his wife. Yet few spoke up. Some whispered among themselves. Others assumed it was none of their business. Silence, in the end, acted as complicity. One neighbor later admitted, We knew something was off, but you never think it'll end in murder, a pattern of tragedy. The Plattle case isn't unique. History is littered with stories of grooming within families, of boundaries broken, of tragedy born from silence. Psychologists call it genetic sexual attraction, a phenomenon where biological relatives, separated at birth and reunited later, sometimes feel intense, misplaced attraction. Most resist it, but in rare, dangerous cases, the attraction spirals into relationships that destabilize entire families. In Stephen's case, it wasn't mere attraction, it was exploitation. Katie was barely out of adolescence. She was vulnerable, searching for connection. He gave her attention, affection, and the illusion of love, and when she finally realized it was all control, all manipulation, it was too late. The day the sky fell, April 12th, 2018, began like any other spring morning. The sun rose gently over New Milford, casting golden light across quiet suburban streets. Katie and her adoptive father, Anthony, set out in their truck, unaware that death was already trailing them. Stephen had spent hours driving north. His van carried not only his rage, but also an arsenal, the AR-15 style rifle he would use, ammunition, and the weight of his murderous resolve. At that intersection, when their vehicles aligned, time seemed to collapse. Witnesses later described the shooting as an explosion of chaos. Glass shattered, metal twisted, and in seconds, father and daughter were gone. Stephen fled, but he didn't run far. By the time police located his minivan in Dover, New York, he was already dead, the rifle still by his side. Ripples of loss. The Fusco family's grief was immeasurable. They lost Katie, their daughter of 2 decades. They lost Anthony, a husband and father whose kindness touched everyone who knew him. And they lost baby Bennett, a grandson whose life had barely begun. Alyssa's grief was doubled. She had once given Katie up to save her from Stephen's abuse. Now she had lost her to him anyway. In interviews, her voice trembled as she spoke. He was sick, he was controlling, and he destroyed everything. The community mourned. 2 candlelight vigils were held. Strangers left flowers at the Fusco home. Online, thousands of people asked how such a tragedy could have happened, and whether it could have been prevented. Lessons in the darkness. The story of Stephen and Katie Plattle is more than just a headline. It is a warning. It warns us of the insidious nature of grooming, how it disguises itself as love, how it preys on vulnerability, how it thrives in secrecy. Warns us of the dangers of silence, how neighbors, friends, and even authorities sometimes look away, hoping problems will resolve themselves. And it warns us of the cracks in the system, how legal frameworks, slow to act, can leave space for tragedy to unfold. Whisper in the night. As the years pass, the Plattle case remains one of the most haunting examples of how family bonds can be twisted into something monstrous. It lingers in the true crime world as both cautionary tale and chilling mystery. Katie should have been safe. Anthony should have been protected. Baby Bennett should have had a lifetime ahead of him. Instead, all were silenced by a man who could not bear to lose control. And as we whispered this story into the night, it is not merely to recount the horrors of the past, but to remind ourselves of the vigilance required in the present. Abuse hides in shadows. Control hides behind smiles, and sometimes the danger is closest where we expect. Love. This has been another journey into the chilling depths here at Crime Whispers. Thank you for walking through the shadows with me. If this story resonated with you, remember to like, share, and subscribe, so we may continue unearthing the whispers the night carries. Till next time, stay safe, stay aware, and let the night watch over you.